He's flat-footed. Angelo claims that in the fourth round he will get him or sooner. Would you believe it is Leonard coming to Duran and Duran backing up on him?
What's up, everybody? This is a brand new podcast called The Fabulous Four Podcast. And what we're doing here is we are taking the era of Sugar Ray Leonard, Tommy Hearns, Marvelous Marvin Hagler, and Roberto Duran, and we're breaking down each of the fights that they've had. Duan and I have talked about this on previous episodes of Fight Game Blog Radio, and we've spent a lot of time researching. We are now ready to record the very first episode, which is Sugar Ray Leonard versus Roberto Duran, the very first fight from 1980 in Montreal. So, bringing on our boxing extraordinaire, he's the man who I listen to when it comes to anything boxing related because he has such great takes. Duan, how's it going?
How's it going, GG? You know, I guess traditionally in boxing, the money division has always been the heavyweights. And, you know, this is something that was a little bit of a shift from that, what we're going to talk about today. It's the Fabulous Four came along at a time when there was a bit of a lull in the heavyweight division and they kind of revived interest back in the sport. You know, Ali was the last big breakout boxing star. And while Ali fought on till 81, his last big win was, you know, the rematch against Leon Spinks in 79. The next big heavyweight star after him to emerge was Iron Mike Tyson. And Tyson didn't really come out as a draw until maybe, 86. So if you put that on a timeline, you have, Leonard Duran came in 1980. That was the start of this period. You had Hagler Hearns, what many people would say was the peak of this Fabulous Four era. That was like April 85. And, the last great fight from the series was Hagler Leonard, which would be 87. And, so I think what this era really did was just carry the torch for boxing between, Ali and Tyson. I can't remember who said it on the ESPN 30 for 30 show, but he said, the two things that brought boxing back onto the map were Rocky, the Rocky film, and Ray Leonard. Rocky came out in 76, Leonard won the 76 Olympics, and these were four guys who, in Leonard, Hearns, Hagler and Duran, who all fought each other, and the different matchups threw up different results. Every one of those four each beat one of the other ones, and they each lost to one of the other ones, which you don't often see that in the sport. And we often think about the Four Kings as kind of a middleweight story, but a lot of these fights actually happened at welterweight. And it was kind of even before that era, there was just so much talent out there in the welterweight division because Duran was still fighting down at lightweight and Marvin was fighting up a middleweight, and those two were kind of seen as, a little bit older than the four guys I'm going to talk about next, which would be the four breakout welterweight stars of that time, which would be Leonard and Hearns, along with Pepino Cuevas and Wilfred Benitez. And if you look at the amount of the talent there, those guys were all in that late 70s period when they were breaking through to world level. Those guys were all in their very early 20s. There was another very good Mexican fighter called Carlos Palomino. He was a little bit older, but he was right up there with them. And in those three other fighters, besides from Leonard and Hearns, in Palomino, Benitez, and Pepino, they were all in their own right International Boxing Hall of Famers. So when you think about it like that, and you think about the amount of talent out there, it was never really a question of, would this era catch fire and take the eyes of the boxing world? Because it's almost a question of how could it not do that? Because there was just so much talent out there, and it just needed that one special ingredient, though, to make people to step up and notice. And that guy was, of course, Ray Leonard. He was the star of the 76 Olympics. He had the backing of network TV from pretty much day zero. He was exciting to watch in the ring, as well as being charismatic. He was charming. He was a very good talker. And, he was the type of crossover star that boxing needed to get the attention back on the sport. And I think it's probably fitting that this was the first fight in the series is the first fight that it is, because out of the 9 fights we're going to talk about on this program, these are the two guys who feature most heavily. Duran was in 5 fights and Leonard was in 6. So as well as being just a great fight and a great story, it also sets the scene for everything that would come afterwards.
So just a couple of things on what you said. For one, our good friend Larry Holmes would be very angry with you saying that there was a gap in the heavyweight division from 1980 to 1986. Though you'd be right in that Holmes was never as big as Ali, he would say that you are wrong. The second thing is, you make some great points about Cuevas and Palomino and Benitez. We have a Throwback Thursday video series, and a lot of those videos that we've been putting on Fight Game Blog have been related to just doing our research with the Fabulous Four or the Four Kings or whatever you want to call them. I may just call them the Fab Four, but the Beatles, I might get sued by the Beatles. I looked, looking at one of the ones that we recently did was Ray Leonard and Benitez. And, that fight was pretty good on its own right. And just, if there was a fifth guy, it could have been him. He fought, just about everyone except for Hagler, I believe. So these guys are the ones that actually, they're the historic ones, but there were really good fighters, right almost near their level as well, but for whatever reason, they didn't really jump out of the pack. I know Benitez's story is actually pretty sad as well, based on what has happened to him. But just to give a little bit more background on this, it's an idea that we both had. We're both big fans of the book, The Four Kings, by George Kimball, and. It was just an idea of, hey, why don't we do some stuff for the website around that era, around that time frame, and with YouTube and everything, all of those fights are very available to watch and rewatch and post and write about. And, doing it via the podcast, I think, is a natural thing because, we can go through a lot of the information from back then. And neither of us, you weren't even born yet, I don't think, but neither of us, lived the early parts of this era. But thanks to things like the Sports Illustrated Vault, the books that have been written, the Four Kings, each guy has done a biography. And, there are books about one fight specifically. Like there's a Leonard Hagler book that is out where it covers 250 pages of the buildup and everything. So the data is out there, the information is out there, and we're just big boxing fans. So we're just doing this as a hobby to learn more about it and to share our findings and our learnings, through this type of medium. So that's kind of the background around this. Now, what we want to do for each of these episodes is give sort of the bio of each guy coming into the fight. Now, the first two are going to be Leonard and Duran because those are the fights that happened in it first. But as we go through each podcast, we'll give a little bio of each fighter before we go through the fight. So in this one, we're going to talk about Leonard specifically, where he came from and how he rose to the ranks. A lot of his story is very well known, but there's bits and pieces of it that aren't as well known. Duan will also go through Duran, and then we'll kind of then talk about the fight and then the aftermath, and we'll do that for each episode. But before we talk about when we get to Hearns and Leonard, we will do the bio of Hearns, but we don't necessarily need to do it about Leonard because we've already done it, and we'll just link you back to the podcast that we did it. So all that being said, let's talk about Duran, and you. I know you did some reading on his biography. His career fairly well, and so let's go through where he got to. From his starts to 1980 in Montreal.
Okay, well, the important thing to realize about Duran straight off the bat is he's the oldest of the Fabulous Four. By the time he fought Leonard, he was 29, right? And this is a guy who turned pro at 16. So he had this whole other career at lightweight before this series even kicks off. By the time Leonard had won his gold in 76 in the Olympics, Duran was already a very well-established world champion. By the time when they met in 1980 in Montreal for the first fight, Duran had already had like 72 pro fights. He was 71-1, which is just, when you think about it, a ridiculous record. And he had already been pro for over 12 years. So, all things considered, a lot of people think that is the peak Duran. That is the best Duran ever was with that lightweight. Many people think he was the greatest lightweight of all time. So, in spite of all the amazing things he would go on to achieve later in his career, and all the success he would have during the years that were follow, he was never considered to be as good as he was during that original lightweight run. But just to give some background on Duran, the person as he was, you know, he was from Panama. He grew up just incredibly poor. He was one of 9 children, and just pretty much from the time he could walk, he had to work. He'd work selling newspapers, shining shoes, washing dishes, painting houses, things like that. And he just really had to be tough to survive, because like the older kids would, you know, try take his money off him, try steal his newspapers, you know, whatever money he made, he would bring back to his mum, and they'd use that money to buy food for the family. So he had an incredibly tough upbringing. And just one thing I came across that I thought was interesting is, you know, before he came into boxing, the people he actually really admired were the luchadors of that era. You know, Santo and Blue Demon, they were kind of the people he aspired to be, because, you know, they were so heavily prevalent in the media at that time. You know, those lucha movies that Santo was in, you know, the 50s and 60s were such a big deal. And Duran, before wanting to be a boxer, actually wanted to be a wrestler. But he did find his way into a boxing gym at around the age of 8, and he obviously had a very natural ability to pick it up. You know, he ran up an amateur record of 29-3, and his feeling was that a lot of time, like some of those losses he felt were the result of crooked judging. You know, he felt he was kind of held back by boxing politics a lot in the amateur game. You know, he didn't get to go to the Pan Am Games, which he really wanted to do. He really wanted to represent his country and win a medal there. And, you know, a lot of people felt he was the best guy to go, but the fighters that were ranked ahead of him just wouldn't fight him, and politically he was kind of frozen out. So he retired from the amateur system, just thinking, I'm never going to make any headway in this. And he was going back to doing his odd jobs that he had been doing, you know, painting houses and, you know, and things like that. And his longtime trainer then, Plomo, he found Duran one day painting houses for, like, Duran was earning $150 a day painting houses, and Plomo offered him, you know, $25 to fight whether he won, lost or drawed. And Duran's response was, okay, who do I have to kill? so you know, he ran up a lot of early quick KOs on his way up through the ranks of lightweight. But, like, I think probably where his career really started to gather steam was that he knocked out a prospect that Carlos Aleda had been targeting. And, you know, when Carlos Aleda saw that, he thought, okay, maybe this guy has something and he's the one I should be investing in. And Aleda was, you know, well connected, and he had good money to put into Duran, and that would allow him to develop as a fighter and get the fights he needed to actually kind of become a bigger star within the boxing scene there. You know, now the fighter Duran looked up to in that period was a guy called Ismael Laguna. Now, you'll notice him in Leonard Duran 1. He's introduced into the ring when just after Duran makes his ring walk, and you see Duran go over to him and give him a big hug. You know, he was the icon for a lot of Panamanian fighters of that time, because, you know, he was the guy who had made it. He was the world champion, and, you know, he was wealthy and he was successful, and they all wanted to follow in his footsteps. So I think in a lot of ways Duran was hoping that, you know, he'd one day get to fight his hero, but that didn't happen, because Laguna was beaten by the great Scottish fighter Ken Buchanan. And, you know, at the time, a lot of people felt that Buchanan was a soft defence for Laguna, because Buchanan had fought most of his career in Europe, and Europe wasn't really, at the time, rated for having good, strong quality lightweights. And Buchanan pulled off the upset, and he proved it was no fluke either, because he had a few more big wins that year, and he ended up being voted the boxer of the year for 1970 by the Boxing Writers Association. So when the rematch between Laguna and Buchanan came around a year later, Duran was put on the undercard. And he knocked out a guy called Benny Huertas in just like 66 seconds. And Huertas was somebody who was renowned as a real tough guy at the time. So it opened a lot of eyes when Duran knocked him out so quickly. And this is where Ray Arcel comes into the equation. Now, there's a biopic coming out on Duran called Hands of Stone soon. And Robert De Niro is set to play Ray Arcel. And if there's one role that I think, is made for Robert De Niro, and a role that he could really produce one last great performance in, it would be as Ray Arcel. Arcel was this legendary coach. He'd been around boxing since 1917, and he was just one of these interesting characters that the sport brings up. He had cornered a lot of the Joe Louis opponents. If you've ever seen the great film Cinderella Man, the story of James J. Braddock, Arcel was cornered Braddock the night he lost the world heavyweight title to Louis. And what Arcel did very well was his specialty was as an analyst. He studied fighters well, and he could pick up on little things in one glance that, people would never, no other person would ever be able to pick up on. And, he just knew all the tricks of being a cornerman and how to prepare a fighter and get him ready for battle. And, he had been out at this stage, had been out of the sport 18 years. And, some people say the guy who brought him back to the sport was Duran, but that wasn't exactly how the story worked out. Carlos Aleda, who Arcel thought very highly of, had another Panamanian fighter called Alfonso Peppermint Frazier. And he was going for a world title, and he was very much the underdog in it. And Aleda asked Arcel, would he train him for the fight? And Arcel, liking Aleda the way he did, he said he'd be glad to come back to sport and train him for it. And with the tactics he laid out, Fraser was able to upset the apple cart and win the world title. Now, Aleda's other main prospect at that time was Duran, and he asked Arcel would he take a look at Duran as well and possibly consider training him. And Arcel said, I'll pass on that for the moment, because I'd rather just focus my efforts on one fighter and not have to be split between two guys. But what happened then was Arcel was tipped off to go to see Buchanan fight. One of his friends told him, this Buchanan, he's a really good fighter. He's a guy you need to watch. So he went to see the Laguna versus Buchanan 2 at Madison Square Garden, and who was on the undercard, Roberto Duran. He knocked out Huertas as he did with the big KO, and came over and introduced himself to Arcel. Now, Arcel, after seeing the performance and after having the recommendation he had for Duran, he said, this guy might be worth another look. So he went out to his next fight, which Duran was put in with a guy called Hiroshi Kobayashi. And Duran stopped Kobayashi in 7 rounds. Now, this was a guy who, at just one weight lower, had been a world champion for 4 years, and he'd only just lost that title 3 months before he fought Duran. So when Arcel saw that, he was on board with him, and he brought with him, another kind of expert cornerman in Freddie Brown. Freddie Brown was just known as a great cut man, and he's another guy with bags of experience. He had worked with Marciano's corner when Marciano fought against Ezzard Charles, and he kept Marciano in a fight when he had just a horrific cut. A lot of people think the inspiration for Mickey in the Rocky films is, in fact, Freddie Brown. So the plan was set out that Plomo and Freddie Brown would drill Duran into shape for his fights, and Arcel would come in and put finishing touches to it towards fight time. And, you kind of had something similar to what you had with Leonard in that, he had the old sage and Angelo Dundee and his longtime trainer as well, Dave Jacobs. So kind of had a similar setup on both camps in that regard. You had the longtime trainer and the expert. And Arcel was very adamant from the word go that he didn't really want to change anything about Duran. Because he was such an attacking marvel and natural fighter, he just wanted to refine what he did. And it seemed to work because, 2 fights later, he was in fighting for the world championship at lightweight. Laguna lost again to Buchanan the second time. And, Duran promised to avenge his hero for Panama. And, the match was made for Madison Square Garden. It was Buchanan-Duran. And I think Buchanan's team at the time felt that, Duran was going to blow himself out because he'd become so prolific and knocking a lot of guys out early. They didn't think he could hang with him over, into the later rounds. And Buchanan tried to play for time a little bit in the fight and make himself an awkward target. And for a while it worked, but gradually Duran he was waiting for Duran to get tired, and Duran just never got tired, and he gradually just broke him down, built up a commanding lead in the fight. And then, he was well ahead in the fight. And then in the 13th round, just on the bell, Duran connected with a massive low blow, which the ref didn't see. And it obviously took its effect on Buchanan. And Buchanan went back to his corner, and the ref came over to see if he could continue, and he was obviously in no condition to continue, and the ref called the fight. And, Buchanan protested the stoppage, but, at that point, he was way, way behind in the fight, and he would have needed a knockout, and given the condition he was in, I don't think he was going to produce that at that point. So there wasn't a lot of controversy about the result as such, but the way it ended, there was a bit of controversy. But that was kind of the start of Duran's run as one of the great lightweights of all time. Now, we'll get on to his one loss during this era now. This is something that happened at times with Roberto Duran. He was known to when he had these big triumphs, he was known to over-celebrate and under-train. And it's something we're going to talk about later in this series, of course. And this was the first sign of it. He had 2 fights shortly after winning the title, easy fights. He wasn't in great shape for them, but he won them easily. And then he was put in with a guy called Esteban de Jesus. And now, de Jesus was a real solid fighter. And Duran wasn't really ready for this fight. He wasn't in the type of shape. It wasn't a title fight now. It was made because Duran probably wouldn't have made weight. It was made at light welterweight. But, Duran was put down in the very first round by De Jesus, and, he ended up losing the fight very clearly on points. And if you look back at that fight, there was something missing in Duran. He didn't have the same figure and the same aggression you'd usually see in him. And, it was clear that he wasn't quite what he could have been. But afterwards, he was incredibly upset. He was said to be crying in the dressing room and everything like that. And his team kind of went up to him and just scalded him pretty much and said, you lost this fight for yourself. If you had been prepared, you wouldn't have lost the fight. You've lost this over the last few weeks in training. You didn't lose it in the ring tonight. So get yourself back on track, and we'll get this thing back in motion. And Duran took the warning, and he ended up going on and running up like a really huge win streak in that lightweight division, just having brutal victory after brutal victory. He avenged the loss to Jesus 2 years later. He was again knocked down in the first round of that fight, but he battled back that time and he won by 11-round stoppage. And then in his last fight ever at lightweight, he stopped Jesus for the 3rd time. So he went on to dominate the division, but that was his one loss during that 73 fight run was to De Jesus, which De Jesus was a great fighter himself, and he actually had a bit of a tragic story himself. He was somebody who had been mixed up in drugs even throughout his career in boxing. He was injecting himself with heroin and cocaine, and he ended up getting involved in a very nasty traffic incident where he shot and fatally wounded a man, and he went to jail for it. And when he was in jail, he found out that he was HIV positive from sharing needles, and he ended up passing away of AIDS. And he was allowed out to spend his last few weeks with his friends and family. And, Roberto was somebody who went and visited him, and he was said to be, very broken up at the time to see his old rival, and as sick as he was, and he was meant to just be very kind and very supportive during that time. But after that last De Jesus fight, that was when Duran realised that he'd outgrown lightweight, and, he decided to dedicate himself to welterweight. And in 79, he made the move up to welterweight, and then he beat one of the guys we talked about in the intro, Carlos Palomino. And, this was a real statement win, because Palomino had just lost to Wilfred Benitez, and Benitez wasn't keen on giving Palomino a rematch. So it was a very close fight the first time, and Benitez didn't want to do the rematch. So Duran stepped in there. He beat Palomino very clean, and that was the type of performance that set him up for, had every say to fight for a world title in his own right. The problem was somebody else jumped the queue ahead of him in that, because there was another guy who was even more impressive and had more name value and was definitely worth a lot more money to Benitez to fight. And that man was, of course, the Olympic gold medalist, one Mr. Ray Charles Leonard.
So, Ray Leonard's career, I think most people, kind of know the straw man of it, which is, Olympic gold medalist, became one of the TV faces of boxing at a time when, boxing was very popular on TV. We know all of his great fights. I think the thing that a lot of people don't know about Leonard is that after he won the gold medal at the Olympics, he did not want to continue fighting. Like, he was ready to do, some people sort of compare it to like Bruce Jenner. Like Bruce Jenner, who is now a different Bruce Jenner than most people would think of as like one of the greatest Olympic athletes, American Olympic athletes of all time. Jenner was able to create a career based on his Olympic successes. And so Sugar Ray, after winning the gold medal in 76, thought that, he was done fighting and he could actually go live his life, become educated, go to college. He was already with his wife, Juanita, and they had their young son. And he thought the way that he could do this was to utilize his newfound stardom as a way to get into promotions and maybe, be the face of products and stuff. And that was kind of what he wanted to do, because he didn't think that boxing was going to be a full-time career for him. I don't know if it was necessarily, he didn't want to, he foresaw, a lot of fighters and how they would get old, and he wanted to become a businessman, really. And that was really the plan. Early in his amateur career, really where his career started was in Palmer Park, which is where he grew up, which it was a not a very nice place, not a very necessarily a place where you'd want your kids to grow up. But even his mom, would say that Sugar Ray, he didn't give them much problems as a child. He was kind of quiet, and he even himself said, you would think that someone who's an Olympic athlete, like, he would actually be good at other sports. And Leonard kind of in his biography would make fun of himself by saying, like, he was absolutely awful at like all kinds of different sports that his friends were good at, like basketball. He's like, I was terrible at basketball. But his brother, Roger, and this is actually an interesting thing, and I'm not sure how much you've read up on this, Duan, but his brother Roger, a little bit older than him, I think by 1 year, actually got into boxing and was kind of, pretty successful at it, as a youngster, and would kind of, throw it in Ray's face, and actually got Ray to try it. But, in his biography, I haven't finished the whole thing. I'm pretty much through, about 65% of it, but it's kind of surprising because he flaunts Roger's drug abuse almost as a way, almost like sort of like a lesson or something, but it's kind of jarring whenever he talks about it, because he'll sort of talk about Roger and say, Roger told me to do this. And one of the main things was, when he was fighting Duran, he would tell him, you should do this, this, and this. And Sugar Ray would say, Roger was absolutely right about that, but we needed to get him away because he was high, or, he's constantly bringing up his brother being high. So I don't know if there's something with their relationship. I don't know what their relationship is like today, but it was kind of interesting that, this book is not that old, but Ray was very adamant to constantly bring up how often Roger had screwed up. Had you heard anything about that?
I hadn't, but Roger did, of course, fight on the undercard of Leonard Duran 1, and there's obviously a story that will come later when we talk about the fight and the aftermath of that involved Roger. Yeah,
and so Ray really found the sport he was good at, and two guys who would become fixtures in his life, Jenks Morton and Dave Jacobs. Down the line, I think he would have some problems with Jacobs, but they were kind of the ones who were his go-to guys as trainers, as advisors. They helped him prepare, and they would become fixtures in his story throughout his career. And so, there's lots of talk about what they did for him, Leonard, so that he could pursue his amateur career and go to the Olympics, not having a lot of money. But I think one of the most important things is when Sugar Ray decided to finally turn pro, which some of it had to do with his father and his mother's health, really. He was introduced to a guy named Mike Trainer, who became his financial advisor, and I believe it was a friend of Jenks Morton's, and that relationship really became maybe one of the most important relationships that Sugar Ray would go on to have, because Trainer his financial his aptitude about business allowed Leonard to really call the shots, pretty much for the rest of his career. You talked about the Benitez fight. A big part of that fight happening is because Leonard was already such a face of boxing, and in order to make that fight, they had to acquiesce a little bit, because the Benitez camp didn't really want it to come out that he wasn't worth as much as Ray, and so they made it worth it in the end. But Ray from the get-go, I think you had even sort of alluded to this, he was really kind of controlling everything. There was a deal with ABC that they had created, and they didn't want to tie Ray into too many fights, because Trainer believed that Ray would stay undefeated, and part of this is because of the matchmaking helped out by Angelo Dundee, who actually came in, and he wasn't Ray's day-to-day trainer, but he would sort of, what you said about Arcel, would come in and kind of make sure that the game plan was straight, and that Ray was looking good. But he also helped, a lot of it was in the matchmaking, making the matches for Ray at the right time, not pushing him into a fight with Tommy Hearns before either guy was really ready, but knowing that down the line, this fight is going to mean a lot of money. And at the time that it was being talked about, it wasn't even worth a quarter of that. So just having that outlook. So, Ray really had a lot of, sort of angels sitting on his shoulder, which helped him, become as successful as he did. And so, there are some pretty monumental opponents, mostly by name rather than by actual boxing expertise. When you actually look at Ray's the chronology of his fights, you have guys like Dickie Eklund, who, as everybody knows, was the trainer of Mickey Ward, and if you watch the movie with Mark Wahlberg called The Fighter. that role was very prominent, maybe the best role in the entire movie. And it's funny because, they play out the fight between Ray and Eklund in the movie, and there's a knockdown in the movie of Eklund knocking down Leonard, and it being a big part of the movie. But in reality, it was more of like a slip or whatever from Ray. But that fight, because it was held in Boston. And Eklund was, I think they called him the Pride of Lowell, which is a small town in Massachusetts. Ray goes back to that fight a lot because he heard a lot of racist remarks about him, and he saw, and it really affected him at the time, only his 13th fight. And right after that, his 14th fight, and, this is one of our Thursday Throwback videos too, or Throwback Thursday videos, is Floyd Mayweather Sr. So you could see, Ray and Money May's father go at it, which is an interesting fight to watch because Mayweather's style is, it's a lesser version of his son's style, but still very much, the same kind of style of fighting. Thankfully, Floyd Jr. is just, he's just a better fighter than his dad. But that was very early in Floyd Sr.'s career too. And so you got names like that on the list of fights for Ray, but it wasn't until the fight that you kind of alluded to, which was the fight with Wilfred Benitez, which would have been on 1979, late November, and that win by Ray by knocking Benitez out with 6 seconds to go in the 15th round. That now made him the welterweight champion, and it set up the fight that we are going to talk about. A couple of interesting things about this, actually, before we even get to the fight, and things that I guess I sort of knew in the background, but didn't even really realize. But at this point in the game, you already mentioned that Duran had 70 fights, or a little bit more than 70 fights. Ray was 26-0 after beating Benitez. He had one more fight that was kind of a tune-up for Duran. It was against Dave Green. He knocked Dave Green out. But when you compare the amount of rounds each guy fought, Duran had a lot of fights early in his career where he's putting guys down in the 4th and the 5th, in the 1st. But as Duran moves up from lightweight to welterweight, he's going through a lot of decisions. Right before he fights Sugar Ray, there are a couple of fights. You mentioned the Palomino fight. There's a fight. There's like a 3-fight series there in 1979 where he's going to unanimous decisions. And at the time, there was talk that as a lightweight, he was an absolute destroyer. But as he moved up in weight to welterweight, did he have the power? Because if you watch both of the guys, when they get into the ring, Sugar Ray's a little bit taller. He's a little bit more sculpted, and he just looks a little bit bigger than Duran. But then Duran is such the aggressor, it sort of changes the tune immediately. But that was kind of a thing that I was interested in reading about, was the idea that Duran himself, was moving up in weight, and there were questions about him just as much as there were questions about Ray and just the upping the competition, because you go from, guys who are solid fighters, but again, Angelo Dundee is helping with the matchmaking and making sure that, this guy stays undefeated, which is a big part of the thing, because it allowed Ray to constantly renegotiate with these TV networks. And this fight, he becomes the biggest box office name in history. And not to say that he was bigger than Muhammad Ali, but when it comes to the money standpoint, for this fight with Roberto Duran, he earns upwards of near $10 million just to sign on the dotted line, and with a lot of the stuff, and when it comes to closed circuit and gate. But that's more than anybody else had made at that point for one particular fight. So just a couple of tidbits that, before we get into it. But what did you think, going back and reading like, I guess I'd never realized that there was curiosity about whether Duran's power would transfer from lightweight to welterweight.
Yeah, that was one of the big issues, and that's what made Leonard a favourite going into the fight. He was a 9-5 favourite going into the fight, and the boxing experts at the time all believed that Duran's power wouldn't carry up. And Angelo Dundee actually believes that was the case. He has said in the past that he has the utmost respect for Roberto Duran. He just sees him as somebody that was just an immense fighter, and he would have loved to actually, he admitted years later that he would have loved to get the opportunity to train Duran at some point. But he also said that, his guy was the guy who was the puncher in that fight. So I thought that was something that was interesting. But, there was just a couple of things that you touched on that I wanted to go back to. One of them was, you talked about the two fights with, the famous relative, the Dickie Eklund fight, which is, of course, immortalised in that David O. Russell film, The Fighter, and then the Floyd Senior fight. Now, the thing about the Floyd Senior fight, which he won by TKO, you mentioned that that Leonard's team had tried to squeeze in a Tommy Hearns fight past Dundee, and Dundee had the right to veto any opponent, and he chose to veto Tommy Hearns at that point. That was when he ended up fighting Floyd Senior instead. That would have been his 14th fight. Now, the split for the purse, if that had went ahead, it would have been 100,000 for Leonard and 12.5 grand for Tommy.
Oh, jeez.
And at that time, all of Leonard's team were thinking Angelo's just being way too cautious here. There's no point. Ray's well capable for him, but Angelo's saying, he's not ready for him yet. In maybe a couple of years, he'll be ready for a Tommy Hearns. And, over the next few months, they all saw that, Angelo was right. And just think about what a big history-changing moment that would have been had that fight happened then and not when it did. But there was just two bills that I wanted to talk about that just because they bring our four kings together a bit. And there are two bills at Caesars. The first one is the one you just mentioned, which was Leonard's knockout just before the Benitez fight, the one-round knockout of Andy Price. That was a bill that was topped by Holmes versus Shavers, and the Leonard shared the bill on that with Duran against Gonzalez, and Duran got a 10-round decision on that. And he didn't look good at all that night, and Leonard looked absolutely incredible, and Duran was a bit of a disappointment, and that was a big stage for both of them. The very next bill after that was, of course, the Benitez-Leonard fight. And what's interesting about this one is who he shared the bill with that night was Marvin Hagler. Marvin Hagler and Ray Leonard both fought for their first world title on the same night. Hagler fought Vito Antuofermo that night, and he got jobbed by a bad judging decision, which is one of the reasons why people think that maybe Ray really went for the finish in that final round, because he'd seen what had happened to Marvin. But also on that fight, that was meant to be a triple header, that card at Caesars, but the third fight that was meant to be on it was a WBA light heavyweight title fight. Now, Leonard was fighting for the WBC belt, and there was a conflict of interest there. They didn't want both titles happening in the title fights happening on the same venue. So, because of boxing politics, the WBA title fight got moved to Louisiana. To bring up the gate there, they brought in, a guy who was a fast rising star also at welterweight, which was Tommy Hearns, to prop up the card. So Tommy Hearns got a unanimous decision over Mike Colbert. Highlights of that were shown on that broadcast alongside Antuofermo versus Hagler and Leonard Benitez. So that was the first exposure a lot of people had to Hagler and Hearns, having already, had a lot of time to see Leonard, whose career had from day one had been on network television.
The a couple of things that I thought were interesting. There was a joint promotion between Bob Arum and Don King, and like I said about Mike Traynor earlier, he was able to manage the financials and create all these deals for Leonard, and also keeping him away from Bob Arum and Don King. He didn't really believe that he needed those guys to be the point men in any of these negotiations. But what he did was he understood that he needed Bob Arum's knowledge from a closed circuit perspective. Arum had a lot of knowledge that would help the promotional package and the overall money deal, but he knew that he didn't need him otherwise, except for that part of it. So he brought in Arum late, and then he also brought in Don King because there was a worry that Don King would actually sabotage the venture if he wasn't involved. So it was almost like bringing in Don King to make sure that he just felt like he was a part of it. So they get the joint promotion for this fight. And there's a funny scene, and you I may let you talk about this, but do you remember in your research about how they're going to get on an airplane together, and Don King just kind of all of a sudden shows up on the same airplane at the last second?
I don't remember that story. You tell.
So they're about to, I believe Trainer. I think Trainer is either on this plane or someone who is on the plane with Arum. I can't remember the exact detail, but Don King just shows up unannounced. Like, they did not expect him to be on this plane. And so Arum and King are just not talking to each other at all. And the plane is absolutely just uncomfortable. And Trainer basically says, look, we can do this with both of you or without both of you. So you guys need to, sort of get along here, or you'll both be locked out. And so then, they exchanged pleasantries and sort of they were able to make it work. But, that was how, that just amazed to me to see how Trainer was able to control the entire game with those big business minds, those big egos. But Sugar Ray was the guy. And, Sugar Ray didn't need Arum and King. Arum and King, wanted to be on the coattails for this thing because, Arum especially could make it better. And King, just because, if he wasn't in on it, it would be sort of a big story and a hit against him. Now, I
guess one thing that I'd just bring up there is, the fight that was originally desired at this point was, in fact, Ray Leonard against Pipino Cuevas, because that would have been, there was only two sanctioning bodies then, WBC and WBA, and Leonard had the WBC title and Cuevas had the WBA title. Now, what happened was, in that instance, was King actually pulled some strings and put pressure on the WBA. The WBA is based out of Panama, and they said King was basically putting across that by sanctioning Leonard, Cuevas, they were blocking out Duran, who was a son of Panama, and they were keeping him out of the title picture and destroying his aspirations. And that put pressure on them to pull Cuevas from that fight. And that's how they got the opportunity to bring Duran into that fight. And, that was kind of their link to Arum, because Arum was going to promote the Leonard Cuevas fight. So he had a connection there. King, through Aletta, had a connection to Duran. And, as you said, they decided to form their own promotional company for that fight. It was BADK Promotions, which is Bob Arum, Don King Promotions. And if you're to ask how long that unholy alliance lasted, it would have been exactly this fight only. The thing was, we look at kind of Don King and Bob Arum in later years, and they kind of became sort of friendly rivals, but at that time they really couldn't stand each other. They just didn't want to even be in the same room with each other. And as you said, Mike Trainer just basically said, look, there's enough money to go around for everybody. You two get on and stop rooting this, or we'll just do it without you.
Right. Now, I have a quote from Duran that I want to get your take on. It was from a Sports Illustrated article that came out, I believe, right before this fight was about to happen. So Duran is talking about Leonard here. He says, "I've studied him more than my own shadow. I'm ready for any terrain he's prepared to step into. He's a good boxer, but he's not going to be boxing. But no, he's a good boxer, but he's going to be boxing a better one. He thinks with his clowning and psyching that he's going to get me angry and get me to lose my head. No, my son, I have what they call in Panama my special reserve. My style is to bob and weave, and tomorrow it could be better than ever. If Leonard is to beat me, he would have to fight me. He would have to apply pressure too. Now, the reason why I bring up this quote is because the overall theme of this fight is that Sugar Ray Leonard decided to stand flat-footed, were in his own words, he decided to stand flat-footed and trade with Duran. Now, Duran had seemingly won the psychological warfare. That quote, do you think that was part of the warfare in getting Leonard to trade with him? You know, a lot of his stuff was about whether Leonard was a man or if he was a chicken, and he did a lot of things that Leonard still remembers as being so obscene and so unnatural. You know, that it was almost like, you know, to Leonard it was like, well, I understand the promotion game, ha ha ha. You know, we're gonna sort of do this and do that, but wait a second, is Duran for real?
Yeah, Duran's persona throughout this whole build is really interesting. It's one of those things that you'd wonder with like, you know, we have so much coverage of everything these guys do. Could he have created the kind of identity he did? Because, you know, he was a scary guy at that time. You know, like, people were terrified of him. Like, his fights were renowned for being just brutal and violent. And, you know, as you said, he just terrorized Ray throughout this entire build-up. Like, every time he saw him, he'd be shouting at him, he'd swear at him, he'd flip him off, he'd like tell Ray's wife he's going to kill her husband and all these things. And Ray was just so used to people being professional with him the whole time. He was really thrown by it, and he didn't know how to respond. And, you know, Ray started talking trash himself, which is really uncharacteristic of Ray. And, you know, he kind of wanted to show kind of some macho side to him and show he was as tough as Duran. And I think that was probably a sign that Duran was getting in his head a little bit. And, you know, I think years later, Ray kind of admitted, he said, you know, he asked Roberto one time, like, why did you hate me so much in that build-up? And Roberto was kind of like, you know, Ray, I never really hated you. It was all just part of the promoting the fight. And Ray was like, you could have told me, because I was pretty scared.
And, you know, he did admit being a little scared, right? Like, that was kind of weird. And in the build-up, Ray admitted being a little afraid of Duran. And I thought that was really odd, because the thing about Ray. Now, you know, him, you know, we already discussed it. He's the face of boxing, post Ali. I think Ali may have had one more fight after that. I think the Burbeck fight was maybe soon to come, or maybe it had already happened. But, like, that was it for Ali. So Ray's the face. And the one thing that a lot of people thought about Ray could be a possibility is that, you know, he's sort of a propped up guy. Does he have the killer instinct? You know, does he does a lot of commercials? You know, does he really have the heart? Does he really want it bad enough to take it from a savage? And, you know, Roberto Duran is like Mike Tyson's idol from back then. And to watch Mike Tyson talk about Duran from this time, like, it's actually scary. Like, I would not want to be in the room with Tyson as he's like throwing hooks and screaming and slobbering at the mouth talking about Duran. But, like, just the idea that, did Ray have enough heart? Could he dig deep to beat somebody who had, you know, because Ray had far more to lose than either of the two. And you know, he, like you said, he was the favorite, and that was really a lot of it, which was, is he savage enough to beat this guy?
Yeah, and, you know, as we talked about already, you know, Duran wasn't always the most dedicated of trainer, but for this fight, he really was up for it. You know, they drummed him into just incredible condition, and they didn't need to really, you know, coax him into doing it at all, because he was just he reviled Leonard at the time, because to him, even though this wasn't what Ray's story was at all, but he saw Ray as somebody who just had everything handed to him on a plate, and, you know, he'd had to work so hard for it. You know, he looked at, you know, Ray coming in with his gold medal as just a big target, you know, and this would, like, winning this fight would, you know, change how people saw him. And, you know, everybody who was watching Duran's camp at that time, they were all saying, you know, and saw him spar, like sometimes he was sparring, you know, 20 pounds heavier than he was, and they were still having a tough time getting people that would spar with him even at that. He was just absolutely on fire. And like anyone who was watching and observing that camp was saying, you know, you should probably put your money on the underdog in this one, because maybe the upset's on.
And Sugar Ray talks a lot about this in his book, but and some of this may simply be drama for the book, but he talks a lot about looking in the mirror. Like, he felt like he did everything he could to prepare for this fight, except when he looked in the mirror and he looked into his eyes, he says he didn't see the same focus that he usually has. He blamed a lot of it on, actually, his camp and the people who I guess you would say used him, or in his book he talks a lot about being essentially an ATM for a lot of friends and family, and, you know, he couldn't say no to these people. He didn't want to, you know, come across as being too good for people. Like, he wanted to be, you know, help people as much as possible, but he said it was really almost like a second job in a sense, just, you know, having to hand out money and, you know, always being there for other people when they needed stuff. And he said that it was probably at its worst around this time, and he said that may have had something to do with not being able to focus completely. Now, hindsight being what it is, you know, it's part of a good story. Who knows if that's exactly how it happened, but that's how Ray says it. And then he says he looks in the mirror and he looks into his own eyes, and he says he can't see, you know, he can tell that he's not 100% focused. And he talks about going into the ring, and, you know, this is Montreal, you know, where he won his gold medal. He sort of feels like he's at home in this arena, and not being the clear popular choice by the fans seemed like it bothered him. Not to say that he wasn't the overall popular choice, but he just felt like, you know, I'm the one who this should be my homecoming. You know, there's a lot of Duran fans. Like, he was almost insulted in a sense because of that. And I wonder if a lot of that is just sort of to make this story what it is, or I wonder if that's exactly how it happened. Like, did you hear anything about stuff like that when in doing your research?
Yeah, well, you know, Duran arrived earlier in Montreal than Leonard did, and I think he kind of won the hearts of the fans a bit. Like, they compared it to the way Ali did in Manila. He just kind of immersed himself with the fans over there, and, you know, it got chatting to them and got to know them, and they kind of bought into Roberto Duran as the underdog story. Whereas when Ray came over, he kind of came over as more of a big star, and, you know, his appearances were all kind of, you know, photo ops and media appearances and things like that. So I think, you know, Duran maybe came across as more as the people's fighter in the build up to that, and I think that was probably something that definitely surprised Ray when he was going to the ring, because you will hear the introduction for Roberto, and it is just rapturous. But when you hear the introduction for Ray, it is very, very loud as well, but it's one of those mixed reactions where you can hear a lot of cheers, but you can also hear a lot of boos.
So the one thing that I found just in doing research, I found this quote. Sports Illustrated asked Customato for his prediction on the fight, and he says if Duran stays on top of Leonard, he'll win, but he can't stop and rest, because that will give Leonard a chance to use his superb talents. And, you know, that prediction was in an issue of Sports Illustrated before the actual fight. So I found it to be very telling, because, I mean, it was pretty much dead on, like what had to happen in order for Duran to win. And like you mentioned, he really got it up for the training. And there's a funny Freddie Brown story where he was saying that, it was raining outside, and so, they had canceled the run for the day, or maybe, I don't know how, if it was like a morning run and a night run or whatever, but Duran was very happy that he didn't have to run. And then the weather changed, and Freddie was like, okay, now we got to run. And he said Duran was so mad. He was breaking stuff and just being, a jerk about it. But Freddie said, no matter what, Duran, would have to get those emotions out, but then he would still do it. And so, no matter what, Duran, was going, it was in his mind that, this was the biggest fight and he was going to make sure he was in tip-top shape. And he really had to be, in order to win. And so I thought D'Amato's prediction, was pretty right on the money after watching this fight again.
Yeah, absolutely. He could, because this is somebody who's obviously just got an unparalleled knowledge of the sport, and it seemed again there that he was absolutely perfect with the way he viewed this one.
So the fight starts, and immediately the broadcast that I was able to find had Ferdy Pacheco on it. I don't know who the play-by-play guy was, but that was one I was able to find. There's also one with Cosell, right? Wasn't this on ABC?
I think so. I'm pretty sure the version I watched had Cosell calling it.
Okay, so immediately, within like the first 10 seconds of the fight, both broadcasters and Pacheco in particular says, Ray's fighting flat-footed. Like almost as if like, what is going on here? Like he was just so surprised that Ray came out in the stance that he did. It becomes such a huge narrative of the entire fight, which is Ray trying to prove that he is not this propped up guy and that he is just as tough as Duran, and that he's going to make Duran pay for a lot of the things that he said. Now, my question to you is, because of the pressure that Duran puts on Ray throughout this entire fight, would he have eventually had to fight the exact same way anyway?
There's no way of knowing, but you talked about Ray's mindset going into this, and it's looked to me when he was walked to the ring, and we talked about it there, Ray did appear nervous. His mind looked like it was elsewhere. I don't know whether it was a mixture of Duran, the build up, the reaction he was getting from the crowd, or just a whole mix of the whole lot. But he didn't look quite there. You look at his warm up before the first bell. He's very casual in it. He doesn't really seem like he's happy to be there. I think he said in 30 for 30, he felt when he was walking to the ring like he was walking the plank. You know what I mean? And that's what it looked like. It was just one of those things. Instantly you would start to worry. And then when the first bell rang and he planted his feet, I think that's when most people would have said, okay, this is not Leonard's fight at all. And Ray made the point himself that, when he was watching back over the footage, he said, you can see his instinct after, maybe a minute into the fight, his instinct takes over and he starts to move a little bit and move his feet and move around. And then you can see him realizing that he's doing it, and he makes a conscious effort to stand and trade. He goes against his instinct and steadies himself on to fighting with Duran. And I think it was maybe in the second round, Duran landed this big shot that rocked Ray back and staggered him a little bit. Yeah. And he landed, over the course of the first 4 rounds, Duran landed a lot of shots like that kind of knocked him. But when he landed that first one, Ray had this look of just like, what the hell was that? You know what I mean? He looked like he didn't know what he was in for. And the other thing as well is like with Ray deciding to fight Duran's fight, I think the other thing that he's probably surprised at is Duran in those opening few rounds was just as fast as him. Nobody expected that, and he was showing just great boxing technique as well.
There's a couple moments where, and I don't know if this is just me sort of seeing what I want to see when I watch this back, but it was almost like in the first round, Leonard comes up the way that he does, and it's like Duran's like, awesome. This is great. And like he just is it just invigorates him even a little more. Almost to the point of where sometimes like he's like lunging in so so hard that he finds himself a little bit off balance sometimes. But because he's so active, it doesn't even really matter. And I don't know how you scored the first 4 rounds, but I thought the first 3 were very good Duran rounds. I even gave him the 4th round.
Yeah, I had a sweep for the first 4 as well.
But even late in the 4th, it looks like Leonard is figuring out maybe what to be the right strategy in all of this, which is, kind of hold your own for the first 2 minutes and then kind of win the last 30 seconds with flurries and just like insane hand speed. But I gave Duran the first 4. Also in the 4th round, there was a real sort of like Rocky versus Apollo kind of feel to this, where these guys are just throwing such huge punches, tremendous power punches, landing. Obviously, you don't have like the overacting of the selling of the punches, but I just look at it and I go, wow, like especially the way the camera angles are set up, because today you wouldn't see these same camera angles because they're a little bit more advanced. But a lot of the camera angles are Duran has Leonard backed up against the ropes, and so you see Duran's back, but you see how deep he is digging for some of these punches, and you're just going like, holy crap, like he's like digging so far to throw some of these haymakers. It was actually just impressive to watch.
Yeah, just the way he mixed up from body to head, you'd see him just like ripping away with the hooks of the body and then mixing in uppercuts and just taking a little step to one side and slipping out of range. It was really a beautiful thing to watch, as you said. And one of the things that we forgot to mention here was, of course, the referee. Now, like when Ray got in trouble early on in the fight, he grabbed hold. Now, the referee was a controversial choice because Carlos Padilla, who he had stopped Benitez with just seconds to go in the last Leonard fight, which Duran's camp wasn't too happy about that. And secondly, he was somebody who was renowned for not allowing people to fight on the inside. So what Ray Arcel did was he made it kind of a public knowledge that, we're going to be pretty upset if he stops this guy if he stops Duran from fighting on the inside. He was saying, we got to let these 2 guys fight. That's what the fans have paid to see. They don't pay to see the referee getting in between them. So let these guys fight. And the last thing he repeated as well after the fighter introductions. So the spotlight was on Padilla to let him fight, and he never really came in to save Leonard. When Leonard grabbed the hold, he just let him fight. And what Roberto always says about that is, the big mistake that Ray made was he greased up his body so that some of the punches might slip off. And Roberto was just saying, as you said, awesome, because when Ray grabbed a hold of him in close, he could just slip his arms out free because he was all greasy, and he could go back to throwing those hooks on the inside and throwing the uppercuts, and he was constantly able to free up his arms. And then You saw Angelo getting on the ref's case saying, look, break them up. And that help never came throughout the fight. The pressure was on the referee and he let them fight on the inside. And that was a big victory for Ray Arcel, I would say.
In the 5th round, Leonard leans on Duran a bit. And I don't know if, maybe it's a round where Duran figured, okay, I believe I've won these first 4 rounds. So if I'm going to get a rest, maybe this is a good round to get a rest in. So I don't know if that's why it happened, but it seemed like this was the first round where Leonard was able to use his size advantage slightly. Like I saw him, there's a lot of wrestling going on in this round. Leonard was kind of leaning on Duran, kind of pushing his weight on Duran, and then kind of lulling him to sleep a little bit. And then later in the round, he hit him with some really solid combinations. And this was the first round I gave to Leonard. Did you also give him the 5th?
Yeah, I think this is where the period of the fight where Leonard snapped into life really in the 5th. And I think part of it, as well as using his size, was just that Duran, as you said, was putting in so much into those first 4 rounds that when he tired a little bit, I think that's when, as you said, Ray's natural talents started to become more pronounced. His speed was more noticeable. He was able to get those quick shots off first, and he was able to use his technique a little bit better. And, you know, I thought from 5 to 8, that was a very strong Leonard period in the fight.
Yeah, I gave Leonard 3 out of the next 4 rounds. A couple of things that I thought were interesting was in round 6, Duran would kind of duck down and drop his hands a bit, and then his gloves would actually be lower than Leonard's arms. And that allowed Leonard to fire out combinations, and then by the time Duran would get his gloves back up, then Leonard would be done and sort of waiting to reload again. I thought that was a pretty interesting situation there. And, you know, obviously I don't know who you know, was, or what was the reason, but it did seem like in round 6 that there was a definite speed advantage. And like you said in the beginning of the fight, their speed looked essentially the same. But by round 6, I definitely thought Ray was the quicker and faster fighter of the two. The other thing about the sort of this, you know, these next 4 rounds is I did feel like Ray was boxing more. Now, he would go back to doing a lot of trading, but it seemed like there was more movement. He was boxing, and maybe he was getting a little bit more comfortable and with the pace and such. But I did think that he did a really good job in the majority of these next 4 rounds and sort of shifted the fight. Not completely to his side, because obviously you lose the first 4 rounds and you got a lot to make up. But it did feel like, you know, he was actually winning the fight pretty much from here on out. From the 4th, even through the 15th, I would imagine, or the 5th through the 15th, I would imagine most people would have had Leonard leading if you only counted those next 11 rounds.
Yeah, I think a big one here was, as we said, that 5 to 8 period was very big for Ray. And I think there was the risk of Roberto just fading out of that fight as, you know, the natural skill advantage took over. And then in that 9th round, Duran reached deep into his bag of tricks, and he started to make it, when he looked like he was falling away from the fight, he made it really dirty. He used the head straight away. He raked his head across Leonard's, after he opened the cut from the head, but he raked his head across Leonard's face. He was using the elbow to maneuver Leonard around, and he took back kind of a little bit of momentum in that portion of the fight. And, you know, from there on out to the end of the fight, it was more kind of a back and forth type of fight. But, you know, I think that, you know, by making that fight a little bit dirty in that round, I think that's what kind of kept Roberto in the fight and stopped Ray from completely taking over and just sweeping the last few rounds.
Yeah, there was a moment in the 9th where I don't remember if it was a right or a left hand, but Leonard lands a really sweet punch, and it almost like woke up Duran, because right at that moment he did, you know, sort of what you said, and I thought that right after that moment he decided that, okay, this round is mine, and he went out and won that round. The thing that you know, once round 10 started, I had a real hard time scoring, you know, pretty much the rest of the rounds after round 9. And you'll notice, you know, you could never get away with doing this today. But when it comes out to the final scoring, there are so many draw rounds by the judges. And I feel like, you know, a lot of them came in this period because the fight was razor close on some of these rounds.
Yeah, absolutely. That section from, you know, 10 to 14, like Duran gave away the 15th round. He obviously thought he had it in the bag, and that was a pretty big decision. You know, imagine this fight had it went to Leonard, and after doing that, you know, that would be something we would still be talking about today. The fact that he did kind of clown around in that round and take his foot off the gas. But those, you know, 10 to 14 to me are those swing rounds. It's really a matter of what you like. It's pure just heart and endeavour from Duran, but you know, maybe some of the classier work is coming from Ray at that period.
Yeah, so you know, I gave Ray 11 through 13, or no, 10 through 13, or 10 through 12, I'm sorry. But it wasn't like I thought that he was clearly winning these rounds. It was just that, you know, maybe I was getting a little caught up into sort of what I said that Ray does a lot, which is, you know, kind of fight pretty much even back and forth, and then, kind of steal the round late, and I may have been getting caught up into that. But these, like I said, these were so close. I was when I was scoring this, obviously knowing the way that it ended, I was wondering, because I wasn't keeping the score in my head, I was just sort of writing it down, and I was kind of around round 12. I was like, whoa, I know that I had Duran winning the first 4, but am I, when this thing is over, am I going to have Leonard winning this fight? And it didn't happen that way, but it was very close, and it was these rounds where I was like, these are close, but I'm giving them to Leonard, and am I getting sucked into the Sugar Ray Leonard game here?
Yeah, and as you said, there was a lot of rounds that the judges scored even, and that's what I'll take on next, is actually the official scorecards, I suppose. And what they were was Raymond Balderou scored the fight 146-144 Duran. Angelo Paletti scored the fight 147-147. Now that card was the controversial one, because that made it just a majority decision for Duran, because the last judge, Harry Gibbs, had Duran winning as well, 145-144. Now it came out later that was a tabulation error on his part, and he had actually had Duran winning 148-147. It didn't matter, because Duran would have won the fight anyway, but it just would have made it from a majority decision to a unanimous decision. But could you imagine the controversy that would have caused if that had been a real difference maker, if that had changed the outcome of this fight? And Paletti was the judge who had scored, as you said, there's a lot of even rounds. Paletti scored 10 of 15 rounds even, or something like that.
There's the indecision of being a judge. It was amazing. And again, you couldn't get away with that in sort of the current generation of boxing, but they were, I don't know if they clearly saw those rounds draw, or they were just so close they didn't want to make a decision. And this is where kind of judging gets a little screwy. But in the end, so like you said, I have Duran winning 13-14. It looked like Leonard had kind of lost a little will to me in that 14th round. He almost like Duran had just overcome him, and he was. He was doing a little bit of maybe thinking that, I don't know if I have this thing. I don't know if I'm going to win this fight. He did grab Duran by the back of the head and throw the bolo punch, though. Clearly grabbed him right in the back of the head. But
yeah, you have to admire at least the guts to do that in that type of fight, that late into that type of fight.
So, like you said, Duran essentially gives away round 15, and he's kind of goofing around. I don't know if he's trying to show Leonard up, or he's, maybe he feels like, just based on the things he was saying coming in, he was calling Leonard a clown a lot of the time. Maybe he felt like, now that I'm winning, I'm going to out-clown the clown or whatever. But it was an interesting decision, because I still had the fight razor close as well. Now, if you were to step back and look at the fight as a whole, and not even really score rounds, do you think that you would have Duran winning a little bit more clearly than you would have based on the 10-point must?
Okay, well, I'll give my official decision first. I scored the fight 8 rounds Duran, 6 to Leonard, with 1 even, 144-142 Duran. Now, every time I watch this fight, I kind of feel, whether I score it or I don't score it, I kind of feel like it's a type of fight that on a different day I could give to Ray Leonard. There's enough rounds in there that, you'd think you could swing this fight and you could definitely see Ray Leonard winning. But every time I've watched it, whether I've scored it or I haven't scored it, I've always came up with the idea that came away from it with the idea that Duran has won it. So even though I can see the argument for a Leonard win, I can never myself, my reaction isn't to vote in Leonard's favour in this. And if you saw it as a full fight, I think if you just mark it as a fight, I think you say Duran definitely won that part of it. He was the guy who had Leonard fighting his fight, and that's where he got the better of it.
And the reason why I bring that up is because using the 10-point must, I had it 8-7. And so I had Duran winning by one round. I didn't score any draw rounds, though. There were probably about 4 or 5 that I thought could have been really close to being even rounds. But when I tabulated the scorecard, I thought to myself, okay, based on the 10-point must, that was a razor thin fight. Though if I stood back and looked at it as a whole, I thought it was close, but I also thought Duran was the clear winner.
Yeah, it was a close fight, and I can't argue with that. I always, as I said, go back to thinking Duran won the fight. And I think maybe some of it is because he did dominate those first 4 rounds in the way that he did. It set such an instant impression in your mind. And maybe when you look at the fight as a whole, and maybe also even the fact that he gave away that last round, maybe in some ways that worked in his favor, because you kind of feel that Duran had it to give away. He had some more in the tank if he had needed to dig in deep, but he didn't need to do it. And I think if you're just looking at the faces after the match, like Duran looks like somebody who's won a fight. His corner looks like a team who's won a fight. You look over to Ray when they're waiting for the judge's decision. He looks beaten up. He looks very sad, and there's a lot of sad faces around him. You talked about him being an ATM for a lot of these guys. There's a lot of people I think thought, their meal ticket was gone out the window when they were waiting for those judges' cards.
So just to we had said something previously. It was on ABC, but ABC was able to show it a month after it had been on television, and I believe so. The way that the TV for this fight worked is that it was on closed circuit and on pay-per-view. So early pay-per-view in LA and Columbus, Ohio, and that's actually kind of interesting because I wonder why Columbus was chosen to be the maybe they had the
test market.
Yeah, the architecture or something that was created already. But 250 theaters and arenas, and on pay-per-view in those 2 markets. LA being the really big market. So ABC did have I would assume would be a co-sell version, but that was almost a month later that they were able to show it on the free television.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I did not know that this fight was shown originally on pay-per-view. So that's something that, like, another fact that was just a little bit interesting to find out as we did the show.
And so here's a quote from Bob Arum. And again, this is June of 1980. This is the beginning of a revolution in boxing and television, because it means we are moving closer to the day when almost all boxing will be seen, not on network television, but on pay cable. We have seen the last of the big fights on network TV. The networks know they only have 2 years left with boxing. Wow.
Wow, that is really, really interesting in light of how things have shaped out.
So, and Don King is quoted as saying, as pay TV grows, we will get to the point, say, where 500,000 subscribers might be willing to pay $3 to see a fight that the networks wouldn't want because it couldn't command a 30% share of the audience on commercial television. 500,000 subscribers at
$3,
20, at 10 times or 20 times that amount is actually what happened. But very, very interesting to look back at those comments, because one thing that we didn't even talk about at the top of this is the fact that we were getting to the point of where fights were going to lead into the networks of HBO, which is pay cable, and pay-per-view television. And in 1980 is still very early in that ball game, but in order to do that, you do need a star or several stars who people will be willing to pay to see, and that whole transition in the beginnings of that transition is very interesting to look back. Okay, so couple of quotes after this fight was done. By the way, I think the New York Times is the one scorecard that I saw that did have the fight for Leonard. I think every other card that I was able to kind of, I guess which were important back then, did have Duran winning. And again, Sports Illustrated called Pilates a scorecard a monument to indecision. That was the famous quote out of their article that they would publish after this fight was over. So a couple of different quotes here. We talked about Duran and whether or not the hate for Leonard was real, or whether it was just he simply saw Leonard as someone not as deserving as him, and that kind of drove him. Duran says, he's the best I have fought. He hit me hard a couple times, but I was never in bad shape. He was pretty good, but he had to be because he was fighting me. That just the, a lot of times what we see is guys will be overly nice in how they talk about other fighters. But, the thing that I really enjoyed in learning about Duran is just his faith in himself. Like, he absolutely believed he was the best, and he was out to show everybody, Ray Leonard included. And, while he would go on to lose fights from time to time, still, you look at Roberto Duran as one of the best fighters of all time. And I think that quote sort of is the mindset that you have to have when you are one of those guys.
Yeah, and he was showing Leonard some respect after the fight, but at the same time he was showing a lot of commitment to his own cause. Another quote a little bit like that is, he said himself that, like, heart won me this fight. And, when he was pressed on it by the media, he said, are you saying that Leonard doesn't have heart? He said, if Ray Leonard didn't have heart, he wouldn't be alive tonight. He was willing to give him a little bit of credit. And, as you said, this was, for me, the great performance of Roberto Duran's career. And, Michael Katz, the sports journalist, I think probably put it about best when he weighed up on the performance from Duran as being like the greatest display of athletic heroism ever witnessed. He said Duran beat somebody who is bigger, faster, stronger, younger, and better with just his pure willpower alone.
Sugar Ray says, I said I would fight Duran flat-footed, and I did. People questioned whether I could take the big punch. I showed them. I have to give Duran a lot of credit. He is the toughest man I have ever fought. And that's probably the understatement of the night is by saying that, because the thing that I think all of those things are true. And here's and we're close to wrapping up here, but here's something that I'd been meaning to ask you, and I wanted to make sure that I asked it in the right way. But if Ray Leonard didn't have to go through this entire spectacle, and this is a hypothetical, obviously, but I just want to know your opinion. Does he reach the greatest heights that he did? Because it seems like to me that in order to win, some of the bigger fights that he had to win, it was almost like he had to prove to himself that he was tough enough to fight someone like Duran. And maybe this loss to Duran is possibly the best thing that ever happened to him.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me this, and I think you're right. Ray did lose his perfect record that night, but I think he showed other qualities. I think he earned the respect of a lot of people, and by showing that he had the heart to fight with somebody like Duran. And, as you said, if this hadn't came around, would he have had what it took to, get through the fights with Hagler and Hearns? Did he need Roberto Duran to push him on to that next level? Did he need that kind of gut check fight? I think maybe he did. Mike Tyson said about this, he said, what he learned about Ray Leonard in this fight was, he was just a pit bull with a pretty face. He said, he could be a mean, tough, nasty guy as well when he wanted to be. And I think, that kind of sums up what you take away from this fight. Ray has later said himself he thinks he earned 5 years of experience in one night through fighting Duran. And maybe it came at the right time as well, because directly, you said, when Ray got into boxing, he wasn't 100% committed to becoming a pro boxer. That wasn't necessarily a path he had outlined. And, after this fight, he briefly said, he was going to retire, and then he took a holiday and came back down from that. But, had this came a little bit later and he had more big fights behind him and he'd made more money, would he have had the drive to come back when that first loss came in? Or would he have just said, okay, I've made a good living out of the sport, it's time to move on? Maybe the fact that this was so early in his career, well, not so early, he had been a pro just over 3 years, maybe that meant that he could rebuild and go on to have the successes he did against, Hagler and Hearns in those brutal fights that he had to go through later in the series.
And so a couple of fight punch statistics that I don't believe all that technology was around back then. So this is probably someone just watching the fight and gauging the connection rates. But Duran threw about 60 punches per round with 21 connected. And Leonard averaged 80 punches and 18 connects. Obviously, there wasn't a lot of jabbing going on in this fight, so a lot of these were power shots. And Leonard's percentage a little bit better, but Duran threw a little bit more. But I mean, fairly even for the fight. A couple of interesting notes. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Leonard made between $7.5 and $10 million. And that was more than any man had ever made for a prize fight. He actually got 80% of the closed circuit TV revenue. And no, Duran didn't get any of that. The promoters got the remaining 20%. Duran would earn $1.5 million. And I think this distance, when it came to, our next episode, which is their second fight, there was quite the difference. The $8.5 million possibly separated what each guy earned. Sugar Ray taking the large majority of that purse, and it was going to be not a big deal. But they were, when they were making that second fight, it was that was part of the thing. Like, hey, you may be the draw, but you do need me in order to have the second fight.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what happened in negotiations with this fight is, Ray had people looking out for his interest, and Duran really didn't. Duran came in and said, I want $1.5 million for this fight, and that was essentially what he got. Nobody really tried to drive the offer up for him, and he probably could have got that little bit more. But, because we talked a fair bit about Leonard coming out of this fight, I just wanted to, finish up with one thing on Duran. Duran, to me, is the only person to ever be the real Sugar Ray Leonard. Ray had 2 losses later in the career, but that was when he had a lot of issues to contend with. It wasn't in his prime anymore, and that wasn't, I don't think anyone believes that was the real Sugar Ray Leonard. Duran beat him, and he beat him at a weight that wasn't even his best weight. We talked about it before. Duran's peak was said to be that lightweight one. He came up to welterweight and beat somebody as great as Sugar Ray Leonard. And, this would be the only fight he wins in this whole Four Kings series. He went 1-4 in this. But what a win it was for Duran. It was I'd say one of the great performances ever in boxing.
No, that's absolutely a great point. Because Sugar Ray would eventually lose to Terry Norris in 1991, when it was absolutely not the type of fight you need to put Sugar Ray Leonard in with. And then he would come back 6 years later to fight Hector Camacho. And you would think, why is it necessary? And Camacho was another guy who was able to utilize cable television to get some acclaim. But it wasn't the only time that Camacho would go on to face Four Kings guys who were outside of their prime, because he did the same thing with Duran just a year before that. So Hector Camacho wanted to conquer the two of the Four Kings late in their careers when they had no business fighting. Well,
this time on this episode, we talked a lot about Duran's finest hour. This, as I said, was probably his greatest performance. But things can turn around very quickly, and in this case they did. It was only 5 months later that he had the lowest point in his career, and that's what we'll be talking about. On the next edition, it'll be the 25th of November 1980. It'll be the Louisiana Superdome, not the Silverdome, the Superdome should be. And it's one of the most talked about fights in history. Out of every bout we're going to talk about in this series, this was probably the one that would be least exciting, but it's the one that's had the most impact on the sport overall. It's the one that's become the biggest story, because it gave way to a phrase that was, not just used in boxing or combat sport, but something that just kind of trickled into general speech. And for any time somebody says, I quit, and, next time up we have, of course, Leonard and Duran 2, and it's the infamous no mas fight.
And I think that's a great way to end this thing. A little bit of a teaser for our next episode, and we will be back, and we will be talking about Leonard and Duran 2. And so, the first 2 episodes are about the same, the same 2 guys, but essentially, without these 2 fights, we probably don't see, we probably don't get the others. So these are 2 very important ones. Thankfully for us, as we get to kickstart this little podcast project, they are the first 2 that we get to talk about, because there's so much information out there. So for Duan, I'm Double G. Thanks for tuning in to the Fabulous 4 podcast. We will see you when we see you. Peace out.
I'm not your man, not Ralph Tresvant, not Ronnie Romance. No, ma, I'm trying to hit you, then put you in the middle of the round like I'm Roberto Duran. No, ma.